시청자 여러분 안녕하십니까? 법률방송이 특집으로 마련한 더 메시지, 북한 인권 생명, 김주미 특임 PD입니다. 세계 도처에서 전쟁과 분쟁이 이어지는 가운데 지금도 많은 사람들이 다양한 이유로 목숨을 잃고 있는데요. 가깝고도 먼 북한의 현실도 가벼이 넘길 수는 없는 상황입니다. 법률방송은 오늘 이런 상황에 대해 깊이 있게 대화 나눠볼 분을 모셨습니다. 타인의 인권과 생명을 지키는 데 자신의 인생을 던진 분입니다. 먼저 화면으로 보시죠. 데이비드 알톤, 영국의 크로스벤처 상원의원입니다. 의회민주주의의 본고장인 영국에서 10대 때부터 지역사회 정치에 관여한 그 1979년 영국 최연소 하원의원으로 선출된 데 이어 1997년 당대 귀족으로 임명됩니다. 영국은 탈북민을 가장 많이 받아들이는 나라로 알려집니다. 데이비드 알톤은 이러한 영국에서 의회의 북한 인권 문제를 가장 먼저 의제화시킨 의원입니다. 영국 의회의 논의를 텔레비전 방송으로 송출해야 한다고 가장 먼저 주장한 6명의 의원 중 한 명인 그는 북한에도 민주적 정보가 전달되기를 희망하면서 영국 공영방송 BBC의 한국어 서비스 시작 캠페인도 주도적으로 추진하여 성사시킵니다. 데이비드 알톤이 발표한 북한 관련 연설과 성명 자료는 400건이 넘습니다. 태영호 국민의힘 국회의원은 그의 모든 연설을 모아가서 그에게 항의했다는 일화도 있습니다. 그는 영국 의회 내 북한 관련 초당파 의원 모임의 설립자이자 공동의장입니다. 평양을 4차례나 방문하고 그 경험과 북한 문제의 해법을 담은 서적 빌딩 브리지스를 공저로 출간합니다. 데이비드 알톤이 18년간 지내던 하원직을 던져버린 데에는 카톨릭 종교 신념에서 비롯된 생명 존중 사상이 자리합니다. 소속 정당이던 자유민주당이 낙태 지지 입장을 표명하자 당과의 결별을 선언하고 의원직을 내던진 것입니다. 그가 가문 문장에 새긴 좌우명 Choose Life라는 말에서도 그의 가치관을 엿볼 수 있습니다. 이는 성경의 신명기에서 인용한 문구입니다. 북한뿐 아니라 국제사회 곳곳에서 일어나는 대량 학살과 종교 탄압, 소수자 박해와 민주주의 파괴 문제에 목소리를 높이며 영국을 넘어 전 세계의 연대와 희망을 전하는 그. 지난 2월 한국을 방문한 데이비드 알톤이 우리 사회에 전한 북한과 인권, 생명에 대한 메시지. 지금 시작합니다.
본 회의는 통일부와 국민의힘 태영호 국회의원님의 공동 주최로
데이비드 알톤의 첫 번째 메시지가 발표된 세미나 현장입니다. 환영사를 전한 권영세 통일부 장관은 북한 인권 개선 문제에 대한 현 정부의 관심과 노력이 지대하다고 강조했습니다.
윤석열 정부는 북한 인권 문제를 북한의 비핵화만큼이나 중요한 문제로 인식하고 북한 인권을 실질적으로 개선하기 위해 국제사회와 함께 끊임없이 노력해 나갈 것입니다. 북한 당국과 대화의 문을 열어갈 것이며 국제기구를 통한 협력의 길을 찾고 북한 주민들의 눈과 귀를 여는 소식의 창을 포기하지 않고 두드리겠습니다. 무엇보다 북한의 인권 현실을 국내외에 정확하게 알리는 일부터 확대할 계획입니다. 탈북민을 통해 북한의 인권 현실을 증언하고
논의는 이정훈 연세대 국제대학원장의 사회로 진행됐습니다. 북한 인권 국제협력 대사를 지낸 그는 알톤과의 오래전 인연을 소개합니다.
그러니까 아주 다방면으로 인권 분야에 있어서는 그 활동이 아주 제가 봤을 때는 영국 의회에서 가장 활발하신 분이 아닌가. 또 개인적으로는 제가 2016년에 그 현인 그룹, 북한 인권 현인 그룹, 그러니까 Sages Group for North Korean Human Rights라 해서 이런 알통경과 같은 분들, 또 마이클 커비, 말수키 다르즈만, 로버트 킹, 국내에서는 이제 송상현 그 국제형사재판소 소장님도 계십니다. 이런 현인 그룹을 창설을 했습니다. 20여 년 동안 이렇게 북한 인권에 대해서 강한 그 의지를 굽히지 않고 지금까지도 이렇게 활발하게 그 활동을 해주시는 알통경에게 여러분들 그 아주 뜨거운 박수 보내주시기 감사합니다. So the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Professor Lee, distinguished guests, Your Excellency the Ambassador, Your Honour the Minister, and members of the National Assembly, and many of you who are activists in the field of human rights, first of all, thank you so much for the warmth of your welcome. It's a great pleasure, but it's an honour as well for me to be in Seoul again. As we had our ceremony at the very outset, as hands were placed on our hearts, I can say in my heart are the people of Korea. And although my country, of course, our country, has a great affinity with you, not least because of the 1,000 British servicemen who died during the Korean War as you, in your millions, were slaughtered fighting for the liberties and freedoms and the human rights that you enjoy in the Republic of Korea. And I can say to you that as recently as last month, I met your ambassador in London, and our parliamentary group, as you say, is bipartisan and bicameral. We sat with him and talked about the many issues that unite our two nations, and it's given me great joy to see how deep those relationships have become. And for me, to be here again in Seoul is a great honour. I was also, in my heart, thinking as I left Parliament, just 24 hours ago, I left as a remarkable man was arriving, and that is President Zelensky of Ukraine. And he'd come to address both houses of Parliament, Lords and Commons, in Westminster Hall, where, as a boy, when I was just a child at school, I went with my school to walk past the coffin of Winston Churchill. And many people compare President Zelensky with Winston Churchill and compare the struggle that is taking place in Ukraine today with the struggle that we had against Nazism. I went to Ukraine before the fall of communism. I met some of those who had suffered so grievously under communism. I was not at all surprised to see the bravery and the heroism of Ukrainian people as they now fight, literally fight, dying in their thousands, to retain the liberties and freedoms and the sovereignty they enjoy. And for me, human rights, therefore, is also about security. It is why the two run hand in hand, and why I congratulate your government in elevating again the issue of human rights, something.
데이비드 알토는 지구촌 곳곳에서 일어나는 소수민족 박해 문제를 누구보다 앞장서서 공론화하는 정치인이자 인권운동가입니다. 북한 인권에 대해서는 영국뿐 아니라 한국에서조차도 그만큼 관심을 기울이는 전문가가 많지 않습니다.
In the Republic of Korea, and it is good for me to be with you again today. This year, of course, is 75 years since, at the end of the Second World War, in 1948, when the world was trying to come to terms with monstrous atrocities which had been seen their culmination in the Holocaust, with the murder of some 6 million Jews and other minorities whose only crime was to be different. It was at that moment that the world decided that it would try to ensure that that would never happen again. Sadly, as we've seen so often, never again has happened all over again. That period, 1948, saw a new word enter the English language. It was crafted by a lawyer who had seen more than 40 members of his own family who had been murdered in the Holocaust. The word was genocide, genus and side, from the Greek and the Latin, meaning the family being cut, the genocide of the Jews, the Holocaust being the most appalling example in the history of mankind. Raphael Lemkin, that Jewish lawyer who had seen so many of his own family die, insisted, and these are his words, that if persecution of any minority by any country is tolerated anywhere, the very moral and legal foundations of constitutional government may be shaken. That is why human rights matters. It's why it mattered to him. It's why it mattered to those who crafted the Genocide Convention, into which he'd put so much of his energy in 1948. While he was drafting the convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, it was seen as a way to ensure that the world would never again witness atrocities like those committed by the Nazis. However, while the immense scale of the loss of life seen during the Second World War has arguably not been matched since, acts of genocide and atrocity crimes have continued to be perpetrated. Since that war, we've witnessed genocide in Cambodia, in Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, northern Iraq, and now in China, Burma, Nigeria, and Tigray, and early signs of genocidal crimes and certainly war crimes in Ukraine. The charity Open Doors has again listed North Korea in 2023 for the 19th time in 20 years as the state in which worldwide throughout the whole world, Christians face the greatest level of persecution. So in the face of all of this, we've got to do more than make weak tea statements of concern. The UK and are okay with other democratic nations that believe in the rule of law and the upholding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention have got to create an international coalition to keep these issues in the public eye. It's why conferences like this are so important, and examine whether, for instance, deliberate elimination of religious belief in the DPRK may indeed constitute genocide. We've got to restore a twin-track approach of security-related issues alongside human rights questions, which I've often called Helsinki, thinking back to the way that liberal democracies defeated Soviet communism, but Helsinki with a Korean face. And it should be in line with what the United Nations declares as our duty, our responsibility to act. We've got to call out gross violations against North Koreans and against persons from other jurisdictions, including this one and indeed Japan. We've got to call out forced abductions, but repatriation to China as well. And we've got to continue to try and break the information blockade. And here I pay tribute to the UK government and the BBC for launching in 2003 broadcasts to the Korean Peninsula. This came as a result of a campaign that was led by the all-party parliamentary group in Parliament. But as recently as only last week, I had to go and see a United Kingdom minister in the Foreign Office to complain about the proposed short-sighted reductions to the Korean service. And I register that today, knowing that His Excellency, our ambassador, is here, and I hope that that will be communicated back to our government. And I can say that as a result of the meeting only last week, I've now, within the last 24 hours, heard from the BBC seeking a meeting in Parliament, which we're holding just 2 weeks from now. So I don't want to see the BBC's excellent service to the Korean Peninsula that we fought for in 2003 and established being in any way diminished, because breaking the information blockade is crucial, not just to Article 19 of the UDHR, but also to the elevation of human rights. And we must demand accountability. That can be through new mechanisms that are not dependent on the Security Council, and accountability should be linked to things like the Magnitsky sanctions, which His Excellency, our ambassador, referred to earlier on. This is a new tool that is being used by the United Kingdom government in order to hold specifically named individuals to account. And I can tell you that, again, as recently as a week ago, our all-party parliamentary group wrote to the British government suggesting some of those in North Korea who should be sanctioned under Magnitsky sanctions. In other words, the perpetrators and those responsible, not sanctions on the North Korean people, just which can be indiscriminate, but specifically targeted more at those responsible individually. That's what the Genocide Convention, never again, was supposed to be all about. That's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights demands. The UN Commission of Inquiry demands this too. The paths to justice in North Korea may be circuitous, but countries that say they believe in the rule of law must demonstrate to authoritarian dictatorships that we mean what we say. Let me end where I began, with the Holocaust. On the 27th of January 1945, the Auschwitz concentration camp was liberated. As a young boy, Judge Thomas Bergenthal was incarcerated in Auschwitz. He survived. He went on to become one of the great lawyers in the United States. Judge Bergenthal throws down this challenge to us. I want to end with his words. The human mind is simply not able to grasp this terrible truth. A nation transformed into a killing machine programmed to destroy millions of innocent human beings for no reason other than they were different. If we humans can so easily wash the blood of our fellow humans off our hands, then what hope is there for sparing future generations from a repeat of the genocides and the mass killings of the past? One cannot hope to protect mankind from crimes such as those that were visited upon us unless one struggles to break the cycle of hatred and violence that invariably leads to ever more suffering of human beings. Professor Lee, distinguished guests, in your generation, we must rise to that challenge. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this conference today.
데이비드 알턴의 두 번째 메시지는 비교적 편한 분위기에서 발표됐습니다. 사단법인 크레도가 법률, 정치, 인권, 언론, 기업 분야 전문가 20여 명을 초대해 마련한 좌담회입니다.
My name is Eun Park. I am the board member and chair of International Committee of Credo Association. Credo Association is a not-for-profit organization which is to promote freedom and human rights based on human dignity through rule of law and justice. Among the guests participating in the fireside chat with us today are the board members of the Credo Association, retired justices, judges, and distinguished lawyers, diplomats, professors, businessmen, and human rights activists. We are different in callings and thoughts, but I believe it's the passion that and hope which bring us together here to shine a light on the closest but hidden nation, North Korea. Lord Alton, you said earlier that when you first brought North Korea issue to the parliament, you put the both agenda, security and human rights.
Yeah.
I think that Korea is really struggling as to North Korea issues between security and human rights, because some of the people who are passive on raising human rights think that raising human rights might provocate North Koreans, and then it would elevate security issues. So then there's always going back and forth.
Yep.
You know the story that depending upon the government and their views, I think that North Korean human rights issues have not really improved that much. So probably, Lord Alton, you may have some advice or observation to this.
Dr. Parker, it would be arrogant of me to tell you what to do for the best, but let me share this with you, that as a young member of the House of Commons, we were in the middle of the Cold War. I travelled during that period behind the Iron Curtain to take evidence for a group I founded called the Jubilee Campaign, and we raised individual cases. 7 Siberian Pentecostal Christians, for instance, who'd ended up in the basement of the American Embassy in Moscow, were there for 3 years. But this was a case that we were able to get everybody interested in, and then they started to be interested in the persecution that was taking place against Christians as well as Jews, of course, in the former Soviet Union. And individual cases came along like that, and I corresponded with our then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher about it. She became a patron of our Jubilee campaign, and I was very impressed because of two things. Firstly, that she, in Moscow, they called her the Iron Lady. Why? Because she was not a soft touch. She knew that for every SS-20 and every SS-22 that the Soviet Union lined up in our direction, that we needed to have our own independent nuclear weapon. It was Polaris, it's now Trident. But we also needed to increase the firepower, the capacity of the United Kingdom should it come to a nuclear war. And so an alliance was made with our closest allies, the United States, to bring cruise and Pershing missiles to the United Kingdom. It was very controversial. But we also said very clearly in terms there would never be any first use of these nuclear weapons. They were there for our defense.
And they were there to ensure that if the Soviet Union ever attacked us, then they would be starting the annihilation of Europe. And even now, in the context of Ukraine, you can see that deterrence plays its part, the knowledge that the other side has extraordinary firepower. I've used it before, but I remind myself of the words of Khrushchev, who said, only if there was a nuclear war, he said, the living would envy the dead. And any sane person surely knows that. It was very significant that this mutually assured destruction had the acronym MAD, M-A-D, and it is sheer madness if they were ever to be used. So on one hand, we have to be strong. If it looks as though we're weak, then the aggressor will bully us. So you have to be strong. But is that the end of the argument? No, of course not. What did Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan do next? They began the Helsinki process with the support, and there is a difference therefore here of the way we handle the situation today, maybe particularly with China and North Korea, but the Helsinki group, with many of them were people who came from backgrounds where they understood the rule of law, they were academicians, they were part of the intelligentsia, they had been brave in setting up their groups in Moscow to promote human rights. And so Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher adopted this. And we were very fortunate that the world's religious leader at that moment became Karol Wojtyła, the Polish Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, and with his knowledge of both Nazism and communism, having suffered under both, he gave a very, not Ostpolitik, which the Vatican had pursued up until then, he rejected that. No Ostpolitik. He said, no, we stand firm with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in saying this must change. He supported, of course, his friend Lech Wałęsa in creating solidarity in Poland, and we know how the churches then right across Eastern and Central Europe had courage in the years that then followed. This was the Helsinki process at work. It was bringing about change. He would say, John Paul would say regularly, be not afraid. There's a great movie called 9 Days That Changed the World about how he then went as Pope to Poland, and the Polish communist authorities just didn't know how to handle this. And the millions who came out as a consequence had courage and bravery in facing down communism. And in 1989, we see the wall fall. I mean, if you'd said to me in 1986, 87, you'll see it fall in a couple of years, I would have said, I don't think so, but we'll carry on working in the hope that it will one day collapse. I was in Ukraine in 1988. I got arrested going into Ukraine, but they released me and they let me in. And I spent a couple of days, I spent a day with a bishop who'd spent 17 years in Soviet prisons. The priest who was his chaplain had been sent to Chernobyl to clear radioactive waste as a punishment for being caught celebrating the liturgies. I visited churches that had been closed by Stalin 40 years earlier. 40 years. They hadn't been able to go inside. Every day ladies would arrive and lay flowers in front of the doors. Every day the Soviets would take away the flowers, and the next day the women would come again. Here was resilience and courage. 300,000 people illegally came out onto the street, into the public squares that weekend in order to demonstrate for democracy. And in a way, President Zelensky has inherited that courage, and that from that fight for liberty and freedom in the late 80s, they know how precious that gift is, which is why they've shown, I think, such extraordinary courage in withstanding Putin. So, the Helsinki process brought change, not completely, nothing is perfect. In every generation you have to renew these things. Who knows where it will end? And maybe just as I didn't see how quickly things might move in 1989, maybe we'll see fundamental changes if the people themselves are able to withstand the brutality of some of the regimes that we're now dealing with.
You have visited North Korea 4 times. You were sanctioned by China, but you were not sanctioned by North Korea yet. So are you going to visit if they invite you again?
Well, I've also been sanctioned now by Iran as well. So one of our government ministers said to me, David, will you give me a list of countries where you haven't been sanctioned? And we have to keep a bit of a sense of humour. They even sanctioned my family. So my children, I have 4 wonderful children. My daughter is a lawyer. And to underline the point, their ambassador came in to see me with his number 2. His number 2, you met and I met a couple of days ago. This man was the most senior diplomat, North Korean diplomat in the world to defect. His ambassador had not liked a speech I'd made about North Korea and about human rights. So he came in to tell me, had a long, big folder with all my speeches and questions in. I was very impressed that somebody had read all of these. And he said, he started reading me a denunciation. And in the end, he got bored and he said to me, so he said, oh, we hate you. So I said, Ambassador, I love you, but I hate your system. And I hope one day it changes. Now, as we were leaving the building, the House of Lords, he looked around to see if the number 2 was overhearing him, and he wasn't. And the ambassador grabbed my hand and said, no hard feelings. And I thought, this is a very strange diplomatic exchange. Those of you amongst you who have been ambassadors, I hope you haven't treated any parliamentarians quite as I was treated that day. But anyway, a few weeks later, the Foreign Office telephoned me to say, there's a man who's arrived here with his wife and children who says that he knows you, and he's the number 2 in the North Korean embassy. And I said, oh, that would be Mr. Tae. And he said, yes, Mr. Tae wishes to defect. So I thought, this is extraordinary. Mr. Tae tells me, these are his words, he said, I was your spy. He said, my job was to send back all the speeches and all the questions. I was so pleased. I thought, good, they monitored every one of those 400 interventions and sent it back to Pyongyang. Well, I would want them to do that. Of course I would want them to do that. Because I want them to know that despite the information blockade that they have tried to impose around North Korea, in breach, I might add, of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, despite that, information comes out and information goes in. It's one of the reasons I campaigned for successfully the BBC to extend its transmissions to the Korean Peninsula. And I again would say to those, especially of you who are retired diplomats, please encourage the British government not to reduce the Korean service. I'm having a fight with them at the moment. They're not going to abolish the service, but they are going to reduce it. And I think that would be a great tragedy. This is a time to keep information flowing. If we want to change things, it'll be by people knowing what's going on. And that brings me to the heart of your question. I love your country. I love the Republic of Korea. I was disappointed that you were saying and doing less about human rights issues. I understand the reasons why you might want to come to that conclusion, but I'm delighted that your new government has said that it is going to increase its interest in human rights and speak more vociferously about these things. As I said, the Helsinki process didn't neglect one at the expense of the other. We've got to do both. These are not binary, they're not mutually exclusive things. Caring about security should be the top priority of any government. But alongside that must sit its belief in the human rights and human dignity of every single one of its citizens. And for you, that means all of the people of North Korea.
알통경의 이번 방안을 주관한 사단법인 크레도의 이은경 대표 인사말입니다.
오늘 귀한 시간 너무나 감명 깊었습니다. 알통경께서 무려 400차례나 북한 사람들의 그 처참한 상황의 해결을 위해서 그렇게 애써주신 점은 정말 머리를 깊이 숙여서 경의를 표합니다. 마침 통일부의 권 장관께서도 우리 대한민국에서 이제 북한 인권 문제는 북한의 비핵화 문제만큼이나 동등한 가치를 가지는 중요한 이슈다 말씀하셨고요. 사실은 대통령께서도 북한 인권이 우리의 안보 이슈임을 천명한 바 있습니다. 마침 알통경께서 오셔서 대한민국 사회에서 그동안 사실은 너무 논쟁적인 이슈로 치부되었고 사실은 활발한 토론이 이루어지기 어려웠던 그 북한 이슈 문제에 대해서 다시 한번 논의를 짚게 해주신 것입니다. 너는 생명을 취하라 하신 그 정신을 저희도 같이 가고 싶습니다.
데이비드 알톤의 세 번째 메시지는 생명윤리 세미나에서 발표됩니다. 낙태 이슈에 대해 발제한 신동일 한경대 교수에 이어 데이비드 알톤은 안락사 합법화 문제를 보다 면밀히 고찰합니다. 그는 의료 데이터 왜곡과 인간 판단의 불완전성을 지적하면서 인간이 가까운 이들에게 의존하며 사는 일은 권장돼야 한다고 역설합니다.
I'll argue today that in society at large, the legalizing of euthanasia leads to a profoundly negative shift in our attitude towards the terminally ill and other vulnerable patients, particularly disabled people. Also, there are consequences for the practice of medicine when the commitment to care becomes a commitment to providing the option of killing. Take the example of Alzheimer's. There are very few people who haven't had a friend or a relative contract dementia. It's estimated that worldwide, some 55 million people are affected by this unwelcome disease. I remember being very moved by a Korean novel which explores the theme of loss of mind and the loss of a loved one. Please Remember Mum, published in the United Kingdom as Please Look After Mother by the critically acclaimed South Korean author Ga-eun-suk Shin, is the story of a 69-year-old Sonyo who is separated from her husband as they're jostled by the crowds in the Seoul subway. As the doors of a departing train close between them and she is separated from her loved ones, they begin a desperate search to find her. When they ultimately come to terms with their loss, it is only after they've had to consider the life of the woman, the mother, who had made so many loving sacrifices for them, the memories that she represented, and the identity which she had given to them and their lives. That is the way to come to terms with the loss of a loved one, not by arranging a lethal injection. Any of us who have had the sad experience of being with someone we love as they die, especially when they can't remember who they are or who you are, knows how distressing this can be. And anyone who's been with someone after they've received a diagnosis telling them that their life is coming to an end knows how traumatic that can be too. So as we look after mother or father or a loved one, this points to the need for unconditional love and support, not the implicit message that we would prefer that they were dead. We need a society in which such good palliative care and treatment is the norm. In the case of dementia, but it's true of other illnesses too, it is crucially important that we invest our time and resources to ensure that dementia patients receive proper care. Happily, huge strides are constantly being made in combating previously incurable diseases, and we must continue to search for cures, as well as providing adequate resources for palliative care. Dependence on others is natural at certain stages in life. At birth, we were dependent on others, and for that matter, for a considerable time afterwards. Neither our entry into this world or our departure from it are straightforward or trouble-free. Dying is part of living, and that too may well make us dependent on others. We must try to be less fearful of this and question the mantra drubbed into us that independence and autonomy are themselves gods. Dependence is not a cause for shame. It should be a given attribute in a civilized society that a person will be cared for with compassion and not ignored or regarded as a burden. Nelson Mandela regarded the principle that I've just expressed in an African phrase about Ubuntu, that a person is a person because of other people, that the wider community has a responsibility to hold the intrinsic value of another person, that our responsibilities are towards one another. The over-exaggerated focus on ourselves, on our rights rather than our responsibilities, on me rather than you, is at the heart of many of the ills in the world today. Patient choice is clearly a good, but it's not the only good, and sometimes there's an overriding good. not least by the way in which law and the practice of medicine always demonstrate how society values human life and in all circumstances. So what does this tell us about the values of a society where becoming an economic burden will determine your right to treatment, compassion or care? In a letter to the British Medical Journal entitled How to Really Save Money in the National Health Service, policymakers argued that assisted suicide and euthanasia, I quote, would allow health expenditure to be substantially contained. Be clear, our laws have traditionally protected vulnerable people from such pressures, but they've also protected the vast majority too, who, when the homicide law is relaxed to accommodate euthanasia, leaves people open to pressure from those who see killing rather than caring as the compassionate option. Proponents, that is, supporters of euthanasia, will tell you that theirs is an act of mercy, that they did it for the person whose mind had been shattered, or who had been told that they have a terminal illness. So we must ask ourselves whether dispatching someone with a lethal injection, instead of giving them the best possible love and care, and ultimately a good death, are valid or licit alternatives. Our own experiences can sometimes cloud our judgment, especially when there's been a failure to provide proper care or the response has been inadequate. Individual stories can come to dominate the debate. It's worth saying that if we have been fortunate enough to be with a loved one when they leave this world, knowing how much they are loved and valued, that experience should also be weighed in the equation. Historically, the mandate of the health carer is crystal clear. They must always care and never set out to kill or to assist in killing. Assisted living, and for that matter, assisted dying, is practiced every day by good healthcare professionals. Those who practice genuine assisted dying know that they have no duty to keep someone alive who has no desire for officious treatment. There's no moral or ethical obligation to go on receiving burdensome treatment when it's doing no good. There's no moral or ethical obligation to prolong life at all costs, and in the United Kingdom that principle is quite properly reflected in all medical ethics codes. The principle is that a medical professional must assist with the relief of pain and the alleviation of suffering, but their motive must not be to kill the patient. Deliberately eliminating the patient is not treatment. I passionately support the provision and proper resourcing of palliative and hospice care. The founder of the British hospice movement was Dame Cicely Saunders, a devout Christian woman whom I was fortunate to meet. She said this: "You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die." A fundamental problem with the campaign for assisted dying and euthanasia is that it assumes the existence of a perfect world, a world in which all terminally ill people know what they want without any trace of doubt or despair, in which all doctors have the skills and time to conduct thorough assessments, and in which all relatives are what the media like to call loved ones. While many of those who champion the legalization of assisted suicide do so, I'm sure, with the best of motives, I believe it to be a profound mistake. We should resist it because legalizing euthanasia means abandoning better laws that protect the vulnerable and take account of the fears of disabled and vulnerable people which are set aside. Instead of putting their energy into promoting bad laws, legislators, policymakers and governments should work instead for world-class palliative care and resources for health care that values assisted living rather than expediting death.
Welcome, Lord Dalton. It's an honor to meet you. So far as I know, this is not your first time in Korea. What brought you to Korea this time?
It's always a great privilege and a pleasure for me to come back to Korea. I've been several times in the years when I served both in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And this time I've been invited by Credo to come and talk about human rights issues. And I was really delighted to have the opportunity of speaking in the National Assembly as a guest of the Ministry for Reunification to talk about the situation in North Korea, where I've also visited. I've been there 4 times. But in addition to that, to talk at meetings about bioethics and other challenges that are facing both of our countries. In the United Kingdom, we have a very vibrant and very successful Korean community and add enormously to the life of Great Britain. We are great allies with one another. And of course, we also fought alongside you during the Korean War. 1,000 of our British servicemen lost their lives in the Korean War. Small numbers in comparison with the millions of Koreans who died. But the liberties and the freedoms that you enjoy in South Korea are something we enjoy too. We're both parliamentary democracies, and I come as a parliamentarian, first and foremost, from the United Kingdom to bring my greetings and to show my solidarity with the people of this great country.
You had a busy schedule in the last 5 days. First, on February 10th, you gave a keynote speech at a seminar organized by MP 태영호, the Minister of Unification, and Credo. Would you tell us how the seminar was?
The seminar was very well organized, and I was delighted to see so many young Koreans who were there, including high school boys and girls, who all raised their concerns about upholding human rights. And I think that's something we hold in common, not least because both countries, the United Kingdom and the Republic of Korea, are signatories to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there are 30 articles in that famous declaration, the third of which is the right to life. And of course, that is the supreme human right, that if you deny the right to life, none of the other rights are worth anything whatsoever. So we were exploring that issue, and particularly again in the context of 2 other things. One, the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide, and how routinely that charter that was supposed to stop anything like the Holocaust from ever happening again has happened all over again. Why is that? And also, this is the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report into North Korea, which found that crimes against humanity are being committed in North Korea. And so we explored all of those issues. There were some wonderful speakers on the platform. We had a doctor, a woman from North Korea, who talked about the gravity of the health challenges in North Korea. But we also had lawyers, we had people who have been working in human rights organizations to shine a light on some of the terrible, wicked things that happen to people in North Korea.
Okay, I'd like to ask about what you emphasized in your keynote speech.
I started by talking about the 75th anniversary of those 2 great declarations, the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, both of which were promulgated in 1948. And I talked about a young Jewish lawyer called Raphael Lemkin, who invented the word genocide. It comes from the Greek and the Latin, and what it means is genos, family, and side, which is the cutting of the family. And why did he choose that? Why did he invent and choose that word? It was because over 40 of his own family had been murdered by Hitler and the Nazis in the Holocaust. And he wanted to get the world to commit itself to stop this crime above all crimes from ever happening again. And I recalled in my remarks how it has happened again and again. So in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in Bosnia, now in Xinjiang, we see it again. The Yazidis, I went to northern Iraq in 2019 and saw the terrible atrocities that had been committed against the Yazidis and the Christian minorities there by ISIS and other genocidal organizations. And then there are historic genocides, like the genocide against the Armenians and the Assyrian Christians from the beginning of the 20th century, which many countries have still not recognized to be a genocide. So I was arguing in my remarks that we need to update the Genocide Convention, and we need to try and stop the use of vetoes in the Security Council by countries that are complicit in genocide, such as Putin's Russia or Xi Jinping's China. We should stop the use of the veto when those kinds of crimes have been committed, and it should be possible for the International Criminal Court to then hold to account those who have been responsible for committing those outrageous deeds.
You had a meeting with Archbishop Chung Soon-taek. We'd like to hear about your special relationship with Korean Catholicism.
I'm an admirer of the
Catholic tradition in Korea. Of course, it's a historic, long-standing tradition. It first came to Korea unusually through Koreans themselves. So they were not missionaries, they were Koreans who went to Peking over 200 years ago and brought back the Christian faith. And these were young people, but they met with Catholic priests in Peking and then came back and founded the Catholic tradition here. And they paid a very heavy price. Some estimates say as many as 8,000 people were martyred for their Christian beliefs. And amongst those, of course, was the very first Catholic priest in Korea, Andrew Kim, and his story is a very sacred and precious story. And of course, I come from a country where people have also been persecuted for their religious beliefs. Every day in Westminster, where the House of Commons and House of Lords sits, I walk through the hall there, the Westminster Hall, where Thomas More stood trial, a great lawyer, who said that he was the king's good servant, but he was God's first. And he refused to renounce his beliefs, his religious beliefs, and for that he paid the ultimate price. He was executed. I might also add that when the people of Korea were struggling for democracy, it was Cardinal Stephen Kim who provided, Kim Dae-jung and others who were fighting for democracy with sanctuary in your great cathedral here in Seoul. And I always think of this story whenever I come here, because democracy doesn't happen overnight. It comes through struggle. And just like Pope John Paul II and the Catholic communities in Poland became the catalyst for change in overthrowing communism in Poland, so overthrowing military dictatorship in South Korea, the Catholic community played an honourable part in that, and it's not something that should be forgotten.
You are well known as a devout Catholic. I heard that the phrase "choose life" in your coat of arms, this image, is quoted from the Bible.
I don't know about being devout, but I certainly believe in the Christian faith. And when I was made a member of the House of Lords, I had the chance to choose a coat of arms. This is one of the privileges that you're given by the monarch, by the Queen. She's now sadly died, but she gave me my place in the House of Lords, and I was able to choose a coat of arms. So I chose symbols in the coat of arms that said something about me. And if you look at my coat of arms, you'll see at the top a cross, but it's an unusual cross. It's the Coptic cross from Egypt, where I'd done a lot of work with the Coptic community there because of the persecution they suffer. And you'll see two bells on the cross, and my wife's first name is Bell, before we married, and I wanted to commemorate her. And then you'll see two birds on either side of the coat of arms, and these are called the liver birds. They're actually the phoenix rising from the ashes, but the liver birds are the birds in my city of Liverpool, one of the great cities in England, and for any of your viewers who follow Premier Football League, then they will have watched Liverpool play, I'm sure, but these birds are the birds of Liverpool. So they're in my coat of arms because I had the privilege to be elected by the people of Liverpool as their Member of Parliament. And then in the heart of the shield is the Holy Spirit, because I think that we need the guidance and the wisdom of the Holy Spirit all of the time, because we are such foolish people that we make many mistakes, so we need the Holy Spirit. And then two words, and this is taken from the book of Deuteronomy. You're allowed to have a motto on, and people have very complicated mottos, sometimes they're in Latin. I wanted just two English words, and they're taken from the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, and where this choice is given to the people of Israel. I've laid before you a blessing and a curse. I've laid before you a choice of death or life. And what should we do? We should always choose life.
Yeah, I see.
So that's an explanation about that's the first time I have ever been asked to explain my coat of arms. So
this image is from your website. Tell me about these words. Why do you choose this?
Yes, I chose these words for my website because they're words from J.R.R. Tolkien, and some people who are watching the interview will have read his books or seen the movie The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, and others will have read the books of his friend C.S. Lewis, who wrote The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the Narnian Chronicles. Both men were very committed in their faith, and they were both of them academics. They were very learned men who were professors at the University of Oxford. And I love the stories that they wrote because it's about the overcoming of evil, but it's also about the overcoming of impossible odds. And sometimes we look at the world and we think it's so big and there's so many problems and there's so many challenges, and we wonder, can we overcome any of these things? And these words give me hope. There's some good in the world and it's worth fighting for. So however big the obstacles appear, we have to be like the hobbits inside J.R.R. Tolkien's books. And these are small, inconsequential people who, on the face of it, you would say they can't overcome these great, mighty armies, but they do in the end. And they do so through friendship, through solidarity and determination. And I think that these remind me of my own upbringing, that my parents, my father was a soldier, he fought in the Second World War. One of his brothers was killed in the Royal Air Force fighting Nazism, which was the great evil of the day. My mother was Irish. Her first language was Irish, not English. And she believed passionately in the idea of community, of people holding together. And we had some words in Irish on the wall of our kitchen when I was growing up. And the words said, "It is in the shelter of each other's lives that the people live. You live because of your solidarity with one another." And I think this is what we must do, is we have to have alliances, coalitions, we stand alongside one another in fighting the evil in the world. It was a great hero of mine, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Protestant theologian and who stood against Nazism. He was ultimately executed by the Nazis. But he said, "Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." So we have a duty to speak, we have a duty to act.
I'm so sad it's already time to wrap up. Thank you very much again for sharing an important message with Korean society. Lastly, please say a word to the viewers.
Well, I think my final word to your viewers is to say thank you to the people of Korea for the bravery and the courage which you constantly show. One day, someone came into my university office in Liverpool. My secretary said, "There's a young man from North Korea has just come to the university," and we didn't know anything about him. And he told me his story. He'd been tortured, he'd escaped, and that young man now has become the first North Korean to get a university degree and a master's degree from a British university. That young man has got married and has 2 little children, and he stood as a candidate in the elections in Britain this year. This is a boy who escaped from North Korea. This should give all of your viewers hope. And I think that reminds me of the story from Greek mythology about Pandora's box. Everything was taken out of the box, and the one thing that was left when everything else had gone was hope. And we've got to give people hope in their lives. And I think of people like Timothy, the young man I've just described, I think the overcoming of impossible odds, of making things happen that everyone says, "Oh, you can't do that." And I always say to my own children, there's no such word as can't. You can make things happen if you set yourself to the task, but it doesn't happen by accident. You have to put your energy and your efforts into making this world a better place.
I would say we should take your message to heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
법률방송이 마련한 특집 더 메시지 북한 인권 생명, 데이비드 알톤 영국 상원의원과 함께했는데요. 저희가 마련한 시간은 여기까지입니다. 시청해 주셔서 감사합니다.